on the nature of relative and absolute truth. The question of whether absolute truth exists, and if so, in what form, has been a philosophical conundrum for centuries. For most people, the idea of absolute truth is something instinctively tangible, something that exists beyond the confines of human perception and remains unchanging. Yet, as we explore further into what truth means, particularly from a human perspective, we quickly realize how many of the truths we hold dear are actually relative, shaped by context, circumstances, and perspective. The interplay between relative and absolute truth, then, becomes a dance of perception, a juxtaposition of what feels real in our individual contexts versus what might hold universally. Let's start with the idea of truth and its relative nature. Consider the argument often made that there is no absolute truth. This argument seems self-defeating because, if true, it itself becomes an absolute truth, which directly contradicts the original statement. It's a logical point that's difficult to refute, yet somehow unsatisfactory. The reason it feels that way is that it presents truth in a binary. Something is either absolutely true or it isn't. But most of what we deal with in our lives is not absolute. It is dynamic, mutable, and context-dependent. This logical paradox might be sound, but it dismisses the more complex way in which truths manifest in the human experience. Many of the truths that shape our reality emerge from our perception, our language, and our experiences. They are relative truths, true within the context we provide for them. Think of moral and ethical truths, for example. In one society, something might be deemed ethically correct, while in another, it could be viewed as reprehensible. These truths are relative, shifting according to cultural norms and the perspective of the people who hold them. But this relativity does not imply that absolute truth cannot exist. It only points to the limits of human perception. Our inability to view every context simultaneously or fully encompass the vast interplay of variables that might define a truth as absolute. To explore this further, let us turn to the half-cookie thought experiment, a simple yet profound way to understand the tension between relative and absolute truths. If you take a cookie and continuously divide it in half, the question arises, is there a point at which it is no longer a cookie? And if so, when is that point? From a practical perspective, at some point, you no longer have a cookie, but just crumbs, or perhaps molecules, then atoms, and eventually we reach the Planck scale, the theoretical limit of division in the physical world. Beyond this, classical physics no longer applies, and the very idea of dividing something loses its meaning. This experiment highlights a fundamental feature of relative truth. When we say something is a cookie, we are referring to a specific set of conditions, a scale, a perception, a purpose. As we keep halving the cookie, what defines it as a cookie becomes more and more abstract, and eventually it loses that identity altogether. The notion of a cookie is thus relative to our context and interpretation. But on a fundamental physical level, the idea of continuously dividing matter itself hits an absolute limit, the Planck scale, where quantum effects take over, and the very concept of division breaks down. Here, we encounter the interplay between relative truth and an absolute limit. Our conception of a cookie may be relative, but the physics governing its divisibility reaches an absolute point. The argument can be expanded to humanity's role in the grander scheme of the universe. Zoom out far enough, and human experience becomes just a blip, a fleeting spark that in cosmic terms has no lasting impact. One could take a slightly nihilistic view and see human life as a zero-sum game where gains and losses ultimately cancel out, leading to neutrality. We exist, we create, we destroy, and eventually, entropy consumes all, until there is no discernible trace left of what we once were. On this level, the truths we cling to, our values, our stories, even our knowledge, become relative, bound to the narrow window of human existence. From a cosmic perspective, nothing gained or lost in human history has any bearing on the overall fate of the universe. Yet, when we move back down to a human scale, the concept of truth takes on a different meaning. Suddenly, the relative truths that seemed insignificant in the cosmic view gain immense weight and significance. What is true to us becomes truth itself, defined by our experiences and perceptions. It is here that humanity introduces a new set of variables, complex, less definable definitions of what is meaningful and true. It is this very complexity that gives rise to relative truth and truth in context. Therefore, we might conclude that the philosophy of relative truth is itself a human construct, born from our limited perception but absolutely true within the scope of our own existence. Looking deeper can help us to understand how relative truth operates within different frameworks. Let us consider the broader historical theme of cultural conflict over land and dominance, an archetype that repeats across human history. From the European colonization of Native American land to the long-standing dispute between Israelis and Palestinians, both provide powerful examples of this phenomenon. These cases illustrate how cultural narratives generate different truths depending on the perspective and historical context from which they arise. As I previously mentioned, the Israel-Palestine conflict is a clear illustration of how relative truths emerge from competing cultural frameworks. To many Israelis, the establishment of their state is seen as a return to an ancestral homeland, an act of historical justice following centuries of persecution, culminating in the Holocaust. This narrative is rooted deeply in Jewish history and the cultural imperative of survival. Meanwhile, to many Palestinians, the same event is seen as the Nakba, or catastrophe, a period of mass displacement and dispossession. For them, it represents a profound injustice, where an occupying force displaced families from lands they had inhabited for generations. This kind of dual narrative is not unique to the Israel-Palestine situation. A similar tension played out during the colonization of the Americas by European powers. Colonizers saw the New World as an empty land, full of resources and potential, a divinely sanctioned opportunity for expansion and civilization. This belief in manifest destiny framed their actions as justified, even virtuous. By contrast, Native Americans experienced colonization as an existential threat, a force that erased their way of life, seized their lands, and devastated their populations. However, it is crucial to recognize that these dynamics of land seizure and cultural domination were not unique to European colonizers. Native American tribes themselves engaged in territorial conflicts long before Europeans arrived, often conquering and displacing rival tribes. Just as any group throughout history, they too were part of a cycle of conquest, power shifts, and territorial expansion. The relative truth that Europeans were uniquely unjust in their actions becomes more complex when viewed against the backdrop of the long history of intertribal warfare and territorial dominance in North America. From this perspective, the European colonizers' actions were not fundamentally different in nature from the processes of land acquisition that had occurred for centuries, albeit on a much larger scale and with more catastrophic consequences. What is particularly telling is that these conflicts are not isolated incidents, but part of a recurring pattern in human history: cycles of expansion, dominance, and displacement. Similar patterns of conquest and cultural conflict can be seen in many historical contexts: the expansion of the Roman Empire, the Mongol invasions, and countless other instances throughout history. This suggests that relative truths about land and power are deeply embedded in the human condition. The claim that one group's dominance is more just or deserved than another's is often contingent upon that group's cultural framework and historical narrative. From a broader historical perspective, no society exists in isolation from these cycles. Each culture is often the product of previous conquests and assimilations. Continuing our pursuit to find the nature of truth, let's consider the classic Wonder Bread is cake analogy. If I send you to the store to buy bread and you return with Wonder Bread, in a relative and contextual sense, you have indeed brought home bread. That is what most people would recognize it as. Yet, when we ascend to the foundational level of absolute truth and apply a strict technical definition concerning how it is made, the ingredients, and its properties, Wonder Bread might be better classified as cake. This illustrates that what is true within a common, everyday context may differ from what is true when all defining variables are considered. Relative truth often depends on the context and the perspective from which we define the variables, whereas absolute truth strives for a definitive, quantifiable standard. Even in recognizing this, it does not disprove the existence of absolute truths. Instead, it highlights the need to differentiate between the levels at which truth operates. There are truths that hold universally, such as mathematical equations like 2 + 2 = 4. These are truths that do not change based on perspective, cultural background, or personal experience. They are absolute within the logical and quantifiable realm that we understand. Then there are truths that emerge solely from the conditions of human experience. Truths that are true only because of the way we perceive the world. Moral truths, personal values, and even our understanding of what constitutes a cookie fall into this category. The existence of relative truth, then, does not negate absolute truth. Both types of truth coexist, and each has its own realm of validity. Relative truth is meaningful because of the way humans interact with the world. It provides us with a framework for navigating life. Absolute truth exists independently of our perception, providing a stable reference point that remains true regardless of our understanding. The half-cookie thought experiment illustrates the interplay between these truths. The relative truth of what constitutes a cookie versus the absolute limit at which matter itself can no longer be divided. Humanity's impact on Earth, viewed through both cosmic and individual lenses, also demonstrates how truths shift depending on perspective. Insignificant on a cosmic scale, yet immensely meaningful to us. There is an interesting conclusion to be drawn here. If it was somehow possible to identify and quantify all contributing variables, then relative truth itself may no longer be necessary. If all contributing factors were fully understood, many of the truths we currently see as relative might instead be revealed as absolute. The limits of our perception and our inability to grasp all variables are what give rise to relative truth in the first place. Absolute truth, then, lies in the identification and quantification of all variables, while relative truth emerges from our partial and often imperfect understanding of the world around us. Ultimately, to understand truth, we must recognize the coexistence of both absolute and relative truths. The dance between the two provides us with a deeper understanding of reality, one that embraces complexity and acknowledges the limitations of human perception while also recognizing the underlying absolutes that govern our universe. Truth in all its forms is not a simple matter of either-or. It is a complex interplay of what we can perceive, what we can measure, and what ultimately exists beyond us. In acknowledging this, we gain a fuller appreciation of the vastness of truth and the layers through which it reveals itself to us.